Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Christina Baum and I'm a Master of Public Health student at the University of Arizona studying epidemiology. And my project is entitled The Geographic Distribution of Pancreatic Cancer in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. So just to provide some background about where I was studying, I was located in the northern region of Egypt in a city called Tanta, where the Garbea Cancer Society is located. And this is in the province of Garbea, which is comprised of 8 districts that you can see on the map on the right. It houses about 5 million people, and it's a largely agricultural district, so 70% of the population is living in rural areas, 30% in the capital cities. And it's one of the oldest cultivated areas in the world. And then in the cities are undergoing rapid urbanization and development. And this is just an image looking out near the cancer center, which is located just to the right of the mosque. It looks pretty calm in this photo because it was taken during breaking of the fast during Ramadan. So I focused on pancreatic cancer. The reason so is because no really studies on the incidence of pancreatic cancer have been done in Egypt. So it was kind of a new study to look at the incidence and describe the distribution of pancreatic cancer. So some background on pancreatic cancer. It mostly affects exocrine cells, which secrete digestive juices in the pancreas. And incidence rates kind of vary regionally across the world. The rates tend to be higher in North America and Europe. But on average, there's about 5.5 cases per 100,000 in men and about 4 per 100,000 in women. And although these incidence rates are much lower than other cancers that we talked about yesterday, it's a really important cancer to study because of its lethality. So if 100 people are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, 94 of them will be dead after 5 years. It's a really low survival rate. Another interesting reason to study pancreatic cancer is that little is known about what causes it. So I have some of the risk factors listed up here. Smoking is definitely the strongest evidence of a risk factor for pancreatic cancer, but there's also environmental and occupational exposures, overweight and obesity, high alcohol consumption, and family history and genetics that are at play. In terms of studying the disease in developing countries, you have the challenges with underreporting and misdiagnoses. For example, maybe an elderly person is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that doesn't make it to the hospital in time. And then I also have included some mortality rates just to compare the United States to Egypt. Mortality rates may be used as a surrogate for incidence, again because of the lethality. So you can see the incidence of Egypt is lower than the US, but there are a couple of interesting studies that had some interesting trends, which I'll talk about in a second. So the number of reported cases in Garbea is increasing. Other studies have shown that development seems to be related to pancreatic cancer. So countries that are higher on the Human Development Index have higher incidence of pancreatic cancer. In addition, studies have shown that urban areas in some countries, such as China and Brazil, have higher rates compared to rural areas in those countries. And then one study also reported that there's higher mortality in younger Egyptians as compared to young Americans. So these last 2 points kind of point us in the direction of environmental exposures as a risk factor for pancreatic cancer. So the area that I studied was very polluted. It has some of the highest pollution rates in the country. And sampling in the water and soil has shown high levels of heavy metals, hydrocarbons, fertilizers, and pesticides. And these are a couple of pictures that I took in Garbea. These are drainage canals. So basically, due to industrial and agricultural activities, pollutants are deposited into the soil and then are fed into these drainage canals when it rains and the runoff is collected. And then the drainage canals actually are dumped back into the Nile, and then the water in the Nile is used to irrigate crops. So it's definitely a very heavily polluted area, and it makes it interesting to study the relationship between pancreatic cancer and environmental contamination. And I focused on a specific pollutant called cadmium. This is a type of heavy metal that has been recognized as a known human carcinogen for other cancers, like lung and prostate cancer. And recently, it's been implicated as a risk factor for pancreatic cancer as well. So some of the sources of cadmium include waste incineration, textile and pesticide production, and battery production. all activities which occur in Garbea. So I won't get into the pathway of how cadmium flows through the body, but basically it interferes with the use of essential metals, and it may activate oncogenes and inhibit tumor suppressor genes. So these are my research questions. The first was, how is pancreatic cancer incidence distributed across Garbea? And the second one was, are the spatial patterns that I observed related to cadmium distribution? So basically my summer was spent answering the first question, which I'll show you the results of. And this question I've also described in a manuscript that I've written, and the second question will be kind of an ongoing project that I'll be working on throughout this semester. So I had three main data sources. The first was CAPMIS, which is basically the Egyptian census, and this provided me information on population estimates for 1996 and 2006. So my study was I focused on pancreatic cancer from 1999 to 2010, so I wanted to use population estimates from the same time period. And the census provided information on the number of people living in urban and rural areas in each district, male and female, and 16 age categories. The second data source was the Garbea Population-Based Cancer Registry. This is a registry that many students have used in the past, including Stacy Fedwa. It's a high-quality registry that uses active case finding to record all cancer cases. And again, I focused on 1999 to 2010 because the registry was founded in 1999 and was discontinued due to lack of funding in 2011. And lastly, I also got data from the Tanti University Faculty of Agriculture, and this was specific to cadmium concentrations that we found from past research papers. As for my methods, the first step was to abstract the pancreatic cancer cases from the registry. Luckily for me, it was all electronic, so I don't have any pictures of collapsing filing cabinets. I then calculated descriptive statistics, so I included 1,089 cases, which were all the pancreatic cancer cases in the registry. And I looked at variables like age, gender, date of diagnosis, hospital of diagnosis, and residence, so whether the patient was living in urban or a rural part of the district. The next step was to translate and digitize the 1996 census estimates. So this was provided to us in a hard copy in Arabic. So we spent some time cross-checking, comparing the Arabic and the English copy, which there were some discrepancies there. So I got pretty good at my Arabic numbers. And then I used the censuses, the 1996 and 2006 census, to calculate an annual growth rate between that time, which I then applied to calculate the population of the intervening years of the study to give me the denominator for calculating incidence. So that was the next step, using the cancer cases combined with the population data to calculate the age and sex-specific incidence rates. I did this for men and women in the urban and rural areas. I then used GIS to just create a map version showing the incidence in the urban and rural areas, which you'll see. And I'm currently investigating environmental factors related to what might be responsible for the higher incidence rates of pancreatic cancer. So these are my initial results. The overall crude incidence rate of Garbea I found to be 2.3, and the age standardized rate was about 3.8. So the graph is showing the 8 different districts of Garbea. The blue bars are representing the urban incidence rates, and green bars are representing rural rates. So there's 2 main findings that I had here. The first one is pretty striking. Urban rates are higher than rural rates. So incidence was about 1.5 times greater in urban areas. And then the second main finding is that there is regional variation as well. So some of the rates were as high as 5 per 100,000 and as low as 1.4 per 100,000. So considering the variation in urban and rural, between urban and rural areas, this might be due to a number of different reasons. I mentioned that obesity is one of the risk factors for pancreatic cancer, and it's well known that Egyptians living in urban areas have much higher rates of obesity. So there was a study done in the 90s that showed that the rate of obesity in urban Egyptians was 50% compared to only 16% in rural areas. And even in my own observations, I saw that the lifestyle in urban areas was highly sedentary. There was adoption of the Western diet. People were eating really high caloric diets. So this might be one of the reasons I observed this difference. And then also there's difference in the pollution rates between urban and rural areas. So in the urban areas, it's very congested. There's lots of traffic. There's also lots of dust that people might be inhaling particles. And then there's also the difference between workplace exposures. So in rural areas, as I mentioned, it's very agricultural, so most people are farmers. And then in urban areas, people are more likely to be employed by maybe factories or doing metalworking or soldering or types of jobs like that. And so those are some of the reasons that my Egyptian mentors and I thought of that might explain the difference between urban and rural areas. In terms of the variation by region, because the lifestyle of Egyptians don't really vary too much by region, because it's just arbitrary map, I guess, differences in where you live in the region. We think that it might be more due to environmental factors or industrial activities that are located in the different regions. So even breaking it down further into male and females, we saw that the urban male incidence was particularly elevated in Kafr Zayat, El Santa, and Couture. And of course, there was higher incidence in males than females, which is consistent with the literature on pancreatic cancer. So I had lots of discussion with my Egyptian colleagues on what was happening in those three districts. And this is why it's really important to have conversations with people who live locally, who know the area, instead of just marching in as an international researcher and assuming that you know something about the country. So they were super valuable in providing me with local knowledge. I learned that Couture has a large sewage disposal canal. Kafr Zayat, these are the top three incidence rates in males, by the way. Kafr Zayat has a large pesticide factory, and El Santa has a large vegetable treatment facility. And the bottom two are employers in the area. So because they employ men in the area, this could be attributing to why we saw higher rates in Kafr Zayat and El Santa. As for Couture, as I mentioned, there's a large sewage disposal canal there, which would affect genders more equally. And as you can see, the male and female rates were a little bit more even in Couture. And then just to mention, these are the maps that I created in GIS, which is a mapping software. So the incidence rates are displayed by variations of red. So the darker red is indicating higher incidence. And then the urban and rural areas are designated with the hash. So I don't know if this is working. Oh, so this would be an urban area in Couture, and the rural area surrounds it. So as for future directions, I hope to look more into what might be causing the increased incidence rates in those regions. And I'm collaborating with two professors at Tanta University that work in the Department of Agriculture. And as I mentioned, I would like to focus on cadmium. So my collaborators, Dr. Shoker and Dr. Albarudi, were super helpful in that they went to different universities located around Garbea to try to find historical data that had cadmium concentrations. So they were able to locate some research papers that weren't published online, but that had done cadmium sampling in the area. And those that data was collected between 1999 and 2004. And so using that data and the cadmium concentrations in the soil, Dr. Shoker created this map, which, as you can see, this is Garbea in the 8 districts. And then this block in the middle with different colors is an interpolation of the cadmium concentrations. So they basically used point sampling data to estimate what the concentrations might be in the surrounding, around those sampling points. So the red is indicating the highest concentration of cadmium, with the yellow second highest, and going down to the blues and purples. And the reason that it's in this box here is because there wasn't data that covered all of Garbea as a total, so we are kind of limited to that region in our understanding of how cadmium is distributed. But still, it provides us with some information on how cadmium is distributed, and we're hoping to correlate this with the pancreatic cancer incidence rates that I calculated. And I will also be doing more literature search on the different industrial activities and agricultural activities that are occurring in the region, and thinking about how water canals might influence the cadmium distribution, and seeing if there's more data on other heavy metal sampling. As for my learning experience, I obviously learned more about the Egyptian work culture and the importance of building relationships. So I observed, at least in the Garbea Cancer Society, people were very close. There was lots of family members, and people spent time with each other outside of work. And I think it was really valuable to break into that friend group and make friends, so that I could be comfortable with my supervisor. And by the end of the summer, I felt like I could go into his office at any time and bounce ideas back and forth together, which was really nice. I also learned a lot about the religion of Islam, and living in a predominantly Muslim community. So we arrived during Ramadan, and that was really interesting to observe. I got to break fast with different Egyptian families. And then we also lived next to 2 mosques, so we had the pleasure of hearing the call to prayer 5 times a day, blasting through our windows. And Dr. Solomon was Skyping me actually one time when that went off, and he got to see me running around with my laptop trying to find a quiet location. And then I also gained the experience of writing a manuscript, which was super valuable. I thank Dr. Solomon for Skyping me all the time, and sorry that I pestered you so much. But yeah, I also learned how to kind of balance the input of different collaborators and learn how to take their input and make my manuscript even better. And then I also got to observe some surgeries. So I'm not really medical in nature, but it was really interesting. I got to see a uterus removed that was like this big, and the surgeons were super helpful in explaining everything that was going on.